I agreed to babysit because grief makes you soft in places you didn't know you still had. That morning, the house smelled like cold coffee and lilies that had started to wilt at the edges. I had woken up before dawn, not because I wanted to, but because sleep no longer knew where to find me. My husband had been gone for 3 days, and the silence he left behind felt louder than any argument we ever had. When my daughter-in-law called, her voice was gentle, too gentle, the kind of careful softness people use when they think you might break if they speak too loudly. "Mom," she said. She had started calling me that after the wedding, and I had let it stick. "I know today is hard, but I was wondering if you could help me for a few hours." I stood in my kitchen, barefoot on cold tile, staring at the clock above the stove. It was ticking louder than usual, or maybe I was just listening harder. "Help you how?" I asked. She hesitated. I heard it, that little pause where someone decides how much truth to give. I need someone to watch the kids during the service. They're too young for all of this, and I don't want them getting overwhelmed." Her words made sense. Everything she said made sense. That's what still hurts the most. So I said yes. I said yes because I loved my grandchildren. I said yes because I thought being useful might keep me from falling apart. And I said yes because I trusted her. At least, I thought I did. Before my husband died, our life was ordinary in the best way. We had been married for 37 years, long enough to finish each other's sentences, long enough to argue about the same things without raising our voices anymore. He was the kind of man who folded his socks into neat little squares and hummed while brushing his teeth. He smelled like aftershave and motor oil, depending on the day. We lived in the same house we raised our son in. The paint on the porch was chipped, and the third step creaked no matter how many times my husband said he'd fix it. Sunday mornings were for pancakes. Friday nights were for leftovers and reruns. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. Our son, Daniel, had married Claire 5 years earlier. She was polished in a way I never had been, always put together, always knowing what to say and when to say it. I told myself that was confidence, that it was good for Daniel. He had always been a gentle boy, the kind who looked for approval even when he didn't need it. Claire and I were cordial, not close, but kind. She brought store-bought pies to holidays and complimented my cooking a little too eagerly. She asked for advice, but rarely followed it. Still, there was nothing wrong enough to name. When my husband collapsed in the driveway, everything shifted. One minute he was complaining about the heat, the next he was on the concrete, his eyes unfocused, his mouth trying to form words that never came. The ambulance arrived quickly, but not quickly enough. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee. A nurse with tired eyes told me they had done everything they could. I nodded like I understood what that meant. Claire was the first to arrive after Daniel. She hugged me tightly, her perfume sharp and unfamiliar. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "We're here for you." I believed her. The days that followed blurred together. Casseroles on the counter, sympathy cards stacked by the door, people asking me how I was holding up, as if that was something you could measure. Claire took charge in quiet ways. She offered to handle phone calls, to organize schedules, to make sure the children were shielded from the worst of it. I was grateful. Or maybe I was just numb. The night before the funeral, Claire came by with the kids. They ran through the living room, their laughter cutting through the heaviness like sunlight through dust. I sat on the couch, watching them, holding a mug that had gone cold hours earlier. Claire knelt in front of me. "Mom, are you sure you'll be okay tomorrow?" she asked. Her hand rested lightly on my knee. "I'll manage." I said. It was what everyone said when there were no better words. That's when she mentioned the babysitting again. Just for a few hours, she said. Daniel will be so grateful. Daniel? My son? I hadn't thought much about what he needed lately. Grief does that. It narrows your vision until you see all that's missing. Of course, I said. Bring them by early. She smiled, relief flashing across her face so quickly I almost missed it. Almost. The morning of the funeral, I dressed slowly. Black skirt, black blouse, the pearl earrings my husband had given me on our 20th anniversary. I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. My eyes were swollen, my mouth drawn tight like I was holding something in. Claire arrived with the kids just after 8. She was dressed in black too, but her dress was fitted, elegant. Her hair was styled carefully, every strand in place. She looked composed. "You look nice," I said, because that's what women say at funerals, even when it feels wrong. "Thank you," she replied, smoothing her dress. "I'll be back as soon as I can." I bent down to hug the kids, breathing in the familiar smell of baby shampoo and crayons. When I stood up, Claire was already heading toward the door. "Claire," I said. She turned. "Give Daniel my love." She nodded. "Of course." The door closed behind her with a soft click. I didn't know then that that sound, that quiet, ordinary sound, was the moment everything changed. I spent the morning playing blocks and putting on cartoons, trying not to look at the clock. Somewhere across town, my husband's life was being summarized in speeches and hymns. Somewhere across town, people were saying goodbye without me. Around 11, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I assumed it was Daniel. Maybe he needed something. Maybe he wanted to hear my voice. Instead, it was a message from a number I didn't recognize. I picked it up, irritation flickering briefly before curiosity took over. The message was short, a photo, and beneath it, one line of text that made my stomach drop. My hands began to shake before I even opened it. I stared at the phone as if it might apologize for what it was about to show me. The children were on the floor, arguing softly over a plastic truck. The television murmured in the background, bright colors, canned laughter. Life, ordinary and unaware, carried on around me. I opened the photo. At first, my eyes refused to make sense of it. The image was taken from a distance, slightly blurred, like the person who snapped it hadn't wanted to be seen. It showed the front steps of the funeral home, the wide stone entrance, the double doors I knew so well from planning the service. And there was Claire. She wasn't alone. Her hand was looped through the arm of a man I didn't recognize at first. He stood close to her, close enough that their shoulders touched, too close for comfort, too close for grief. He leaned down toward her, his mouth near her ear. She was smiling. Not the polite, strained smile people wear at funerals. It was soft, familiar, intimate. My throat tightened. I felt it before I thought it, that instinctive pull in the gut that tells you something is wrong long before your mind catches up. I zoomed in with trembling fingers. That's when I recognized him. Mark Henson, my husband's former business partner, a man who had sat at my dining table countless times, a man who had toasted to our anniversaries, who had laughed too loudly at his own jokes, who had stood beside my husband at company events like a shadow, a man who had stopped coming around about 2 years ago. The room tilted. I set the phone down on the table as if it were something hot, something that might burn me if I held it too long. The kids were still playing. One of them asked for juice. My body moved automatically. I poured it, handed it over, smiled when they said thank you. My hands knew what to do, even when my heart didn't. I picked up the phone again. Another message appeared. They arrived together, sat together. I didn't know if you were aware. Aware. The word echoed in my head like a cruel joke. No, I wasn't aware that my daughter-in-law had chosen my husband's funeral as the place to parade another man on her arm. I wasn't aware that she'd asked me to babysit so she could do it without distraction. I wasn't aware that grief could be weaponized so quietly. I sank into the armchair by the window, the one my husband used to sit in every evening. The fabric still held the faintest trace of him, his soap, his aftershave. I pressed my palm against the armrest, grounding myself. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe Mark was just there to pay his respects. Maybe Claire had run into him by accident. Maybe the photo caught a moment that meant nothing. But my body didn't believe any of that. My body remembered things my mind had dismissed at the time. The way Claire always stiffened when Mark's name came up in conversation. The way she'd once asked too casually whether he'd be at a company barbecue. The way she'd insisted on handling arrangements, on keeping things simple, on managing who came and who didn't. And that pause on the phone, that hesitation. I thought about Daniel, my son, standing somewhere inside that building, believing his wife was there to support him, believing his mother had chosen babysitting over saying goodbye to her husband. The injustice of it burned. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and walked to the hallway mirror. I looked at myself, really looked. My eyes were bloodshot, my mouth trembling despite my efforts to hold it still. I will not fall apart, I whispered aloud. Not yet. I took a deep breath and dialed Daniel's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then voicemail. I didn't leave a message. Instead, I called the number that sent the photo. A woman answered. Her voice was hesitant. Hello? This is his wife's mother, I said, the words tasting strange in my mouth. The woman who texted me. There was a pause. I'm so sorry, she said quietly. I didn't know how else to handle it. Who are you? I asked. A friend of your husband's. I worked with them both years ago. I recognized her immediately when she walked in with Mark. With Mark, I repeated. Yes, yes, she said firmly. Together. I closed my eyes. How long? I asked. Another pause, heavier this time. I don't know exactly, but long enough that it wasn't new. They were comfortable, familiar. Familiar, that word again. Thank you, I said, though it felt inadequate, for telling me. When I hung up, the house felt impossibly quiet. Even the cartoon seemed to fade into the background, like it knew it didn't belong in this moment. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to call Claire and demand answers. But grief has a way of sharpening you, too, of making you careful. I didn't confront her that day. I watched the kids until Claire returned in the late afternoon, her eyes slightly red, her makeup flawless. Thank you so much, she said, breezing in like nothing had happened. Everything went as well as it could. I studied her face, the curve of her mouth, the calm in her eyes. I wondered how long she'd practiced that expression. I'm glad, I said quietly. She bent to kiss my cheek. I felt nothing. As she gathered the children, she added, almost as an afterthought, Mark sends his condolences. The room went still. I met her gaze. For a brief second, something flickered there. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. I'm sure he does, I said. She smiled again, too quickly. That night, after the house was empty and the sun had set, I sat alone at the kitchen table and made a decision. I would not confront her in anger. I would let the truth come to light in its own time, and when it did, it would not be me who looked away. Sleep did not come that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe without him. Every creak, every settling sound felt unfamiliar, like the walls themselves were adjusting to the absence of my husband. I kept seeing that photo every time I closed my eyes. Claire's hand curled around Mark's arm, her smile soft and unguarded. I wasn't angry yet, not fully. What I felt was something colder, a quiet, steady awareness that something precious had been handled carelessly, like a glass heirloom left on the edge of a table. In the morning, I made coffee out of habit and poured 2 cups before realizing my mistake. I stared at the extra mug for a long moment, then carried it to the sink and tipped it out. The sound of the liquid disappearing down the drain felt final. I decided then that if I was going to understand the truth, I needed to slow down. Grief had already taught me one thing. Rushing only made the pain sharper. Claire called later that afternoon to check on me. Her voice was warm, practiced. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "I'm getting through," I said. It wasn't a lie. Survival comes in many forms. "If you need anything at all—" "I do," I interrupted gently. She paused. "Of course. What is it?" "I realized yesterday that I never really got to say goodbye," I said. "Being home with the kids, it helped, but it left a hole." "Oh," she said softly. "I'm sorry, I didn't think—" "It's no one's fault," I said. "I was wondering, could I see some photos from the service? Daniel mentioned there were a few taken." Another pause, short but telling. "I don't think many were taken," she said. "It didn't feel appropriate." "I understand," I replied. "Still, if any come up—" "Of course," she said quickly. Too quickly. "I'll let you know." When we hung up, I sat at the table and folded my hands together. They were steady. That surprised me. I wasn't imagining things anymore. The pauses, the deflections, the careful control. I began to notice patterns. Mark's name came up less and less in conversation, yet his shadow seemed to grow larger. When I mentioned needing help with paperwork related to my husband's old business accounts, Claire offered to take care of it without asking details. When Daniel called, he sounded tired, distracted, as if he were carrying something heavy he couldn't quite name. One afternoon, I drove past the old office building where my husband and Mark had worked together. The sign was still there, faded but recognizable. I pulled into the empty parking lot and sat with the engine off, listening to the ticking as it cooled. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. Sometimes standing near the truth is enough to feel its weight. The following week, Claire invited me to dinner, just the 3 of us, her, Daniel, and me. The kids were with a friend, she said. She wanted something quiet. I arrived early, as I always did. The house smelled of roasted chicken and lemon cleaner. Claire moved around the kitchen with confidence, humming softly. Daniel sat at the table, scrolling on his phone, his shoulders slumped. We ate politely. Talk stayed on safe ground, work, the weather, the kids' school. Finally, Claire set down her fork. "Mom," she said, her tone careful, "I wanted to talk to you about something." I looked at her. "All right. I know losing Dad has been devastating, and I've been thinking about what's best for everyone moving forward." Daniel glanced up surprised. "What do you mean?" Claire placed her hand over his. I think it might be time to simplify things, maybe transfer some responsibilities, the business records, the accounts, things that could be overwhelming for Mom right now. I watched Daniel's face as she spoke. He nodded slowly, uncertain. I can manage, I said quietly. I know you can, but should you have to? There it was, control wrapped in concern. I leaned back in my chair. Tell me something, Claire, I said gently. When did you last speak to Mark? The air shifted. Daniel stiffened. Why would you ask that? Claire's smile faltered, just a fraction. Mark? She repeated. I haven't spoken to him in a long time. Really? Not a question. Yes, she said firmly. Why? I let the silence stretch, let it sit between us like an uninvited guest. Because someone told me they saw you together at the funeral. Daniel's head snapped toward her. What? Claire's face drained of color. That's ridiculous. I ran into him briefly, that's all. People talk. They sent me a photo, I said calmly. The room went very still. Daniel stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. A photo! Claire looked at him, then back at me. Her mouth opened, then closed. It wasn't what it looked like. I didn't want to upset you. You didn't want to upset me, I repeated. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. Claire, he said, his voice low, why didn't you tell me? Because it didn't matter, she said sharply. Today wasn't about Mark, it was about your father. And yet, I said softly, you didn't come alone. She turned toward me, frustration flashing across her face. You asked me to be honest, so here it is. Mark has been a support to me, that's all. Support, Daniel echoed, disbelief creeping in. I watched my son, truly watched him, as the pieces began to shift inside his mind. I saw confusion give way to something heavier. I think you should leave, I said to Claire. Her eyes widened. This is my house. And I am his mother, I said evenly, and this conversation is not finished, but it will not continue tonight. Daniel didn't argue. Claire gathered her things in silence. When she reached the door, she turned back. You think you know what's going on, but you don't. I met her gaze. Then you should have nothing to fear from the truth. The door closed behind her with a sharp finality. Daniel sank back into his chair. Mom, he said quietly, what aren't you telling me? I folded my hands together the same way I had that night at the kitchen table. Everything, I said, in its time, because I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Daniel stayed at the table long after Claire left. The food grew cold between us. The candles burned down to stubs, and neither of us reached to clear anything away. He looked smaller somehow, folded inward, like the boy he used to be when he'd scrape his knee and try not to cry. I don't understand, he finally said. His voice was hoarse. Why would she lie about something like that? I didn't answer right away. I had learned over the years that rushing truth into a broken heart could do more harm than good. Do you remember Mark? I asked instead. Daniel nodded slowly. Dad's old partner, the one who used to bring those awful cigars. Yes, I said, the one who stopped coming around. Daniel frowned. I thought they had a falling out. So did I said. At least that's what we were told. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. You think something's been going on between them? I think, I said carefully, that there are things Claire hasn't been honest about, and I think your father knew. Daniel's eyes snapped back to mine. What do you mean? I took a breath. This was the moment I'd been working toward, the one I'd been holding back. Not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I wanted him strong enough to hear it. In the months before your father died, he became distracted, withdrawn in ways I didn't recognize at first. He stopped mentioning Mark altogether, and when I asked about some irregularities in the accounts, he brushed them off. Daniel swallowed. You think Dad suspected something? I think he knew more than he said, I replied, and I think he was trying to protect you. Daniel pushed his chair back and stood up, pacing the length of the room. This doesn't make sense, he said. Why wouldn't he tell me? Because fathers don't like admitting they've failed, I said quietly, especially when it comes to their children. Daniel stopped pacing. His shoulders sagged. I need to talk to her, he said. I need answers. You will, I said, but not tonight. Tonight you need rest and space. He nodded reluctantly. Will you stay? I did. I slept in the guest room, the house unfamiliar but quiet. Somewhere in the early hours of the morning, I heard Daniel moving around, opening and closing drawers, the soft thud of something being set down too hard. Grief doesn't sleep politely. The next day, Daniel went to work. Claire did not come home. I spent the morning sorting through old boxes in my own house, things I had avoided since my husband's death, paperwork, photographs, files labeled in his careful handwriting. It was in one of those boxes, tucked beneath outdated tax forms, that I found what I hadn't known I was looking for: a manila envelope. Inside were copies of emails, bank statements, notes scribbled in the margins. My husband had suspected Mark of siphoning money from the business, not enough to be obvious, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. And Claire's name appeared more than once. Transfers, shared accounts, dates that overlapped with times she'd claimed to be visiting friends. My chest tightened. This wasn't just betrayal of the heart, it was betrayal of trust, of family, of everything my husband had worked for. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, the envelopes spread open before me. I ran my fingers over his handwriting, the familiar slant of his letters. He had known, or at least he had been close, and he had died before he could finish the story. I didn't call Daniel right away. Instead, I called a lawyer, a woman with a steady voice and no patience for nonsense. I laid out the facts, sent her copies of the documents. She listened carefully, asked pointed questions. There may be grounds here, she said finally. Financial misconduct, possibly fraud. I don't want revenge. I want the truth. She paused. Sometimes, she said gently, they come together. That evening, Daniel came home to my house unannounced. His eyes were rimmed red, his face drawn. She admitted it, he said without preamble. I closed the door behind him. Admitted what? She's been seeing Mark, he said, for over a year. My heart clenched, but I kept my voice even. And that Dad found out, he continued, that he confronted her. She said he threatened to tell me. I sat down slowly. Did she tell you what else he found? Daniel shook his head. No, she said he misunderstood, that Mark helped her financially when things were tight. I stood and went to the kitchen drawer. I took out the envelope and handed it to him. Read, I said. He did. I watched his face as the truth unfolded, confusion giving way to disbelief, disbelief hardening into something sharp and painful. She stole from him, from us, he whispered. She took advantage of his silence, I said. Daniel sank into the chair. He covered his face with his hands. I brought her into this family. I let this happen. No, I said firmly. She chose this, not you. He looked up at me, eyes wet. What do we do? I thought of my husband, of the way he folded his socks, of the quiet pride he took in building something solid. We let the truth stand, and we don't hide from it. 2 days later, Claire returned to collect her things. She didn't knock. She walked in like she still belonged. Daniel met her in the living room. I stayed back, listening. You went through my things, she accused. I went through my father's, and I found yours. Silence stretched. This is getting ugly, she said finally. We can handle this privately. No, Daniel said. We can't. When she saw me step into the room, her eyes flashed. You've turned him against me. I didn't have to. Your choices did that. She laughed then, a brittle sound. You think you've won? I met her gaze steadily. This isn't about winning. It was about consequences, and they were only just beginning. The consequences arrived quietly at first. Claire moved out that night with 2 suitcases and a tight, controlled calm that unsettled me more than anger would have. She kissed the children goodbye with practiced tenderness, telling them Mommy just needed some time. Daniel stood in the hallway stiff as a stranger while I watched from the kitchen, my hands wrapped around a mug I wasn't drinking from. When the door closed behind her, the house felt lighter and heavier all at once. The lawyer moved quickly. Papers were filed, accounts were frozen, questions were asked that could not be brushed aside with soft voices or polite smiles. Mark stopped answering calls. That alone told me more than any confession could have. But the true weight of it all didn't settle until the memorial gathering. It was a smaller event, held a week after the funeral. Friends, former colleagues, neighbors who hadn't been able to attend before. Daniel insisted on hosting it at my house. Dad would have wanted people here, he said, where he lived. I agreed, though part of me dreaded it. I didn't know how many people knew, or what they knew. The living room filled slowly, soft conversations, clinking glasses, the smell of coffee and baked goods. I stood near the fireplace, greeting people, accepting condolences that still felt surreal. Then I saw Mark. He hesitated in the doorway, scanning the room like someone testing unfamiliar ground. His tie was loose, his eyes darting. He looked smaller than I remembered. Daniel saw him too. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Daniel stepped forward. You shouldn't be here, he said, his voice carried, cutting through the hum of conversation. Mark cleared his throat. I came to pay my respects. My father paid for your lifestyle. You can keep your respects. The room fell silent. Heads turned. Someone set down a cup a little too loudly. Mark's face flushed. This is neither the time nor the place. It's exactly the place, I said, stepping beside my son. Mark looked at me then, really looked. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. I trusted you. We both did. He straightened, defensive. Claire told you you knew. I felt something settle inside me, a final piece clicking into place. No, I said calmly. She told you I was busy babysitting. A murmur rippled through the room. Mark's shoulders sagged. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. It always does, eventually. Daniel gestured toward the door. Leave. Mark hesitated, then turned and walked out. No dramatic exit, no last words, just the sound of the door closing behind him.
People didn't ask questions aloud after that. They didn't need to. Truth has a way of making itself understood. In the weeks that followed, Claire's story unraveled. Friends distanced themselves, whispers spread, invitations stopped coming. The woman who had once moved so confidently through social spaces found herself alone with her reflection. The legal proceedings were slower, more methodical. There were meetings, documents, careful language. I attended some, Daniel attended more. Each time I watched him stand a little straighter, speak a little firmer. One afternoon he came to my house and sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd poured coffee for two without thinking. "She wants to settle," he said, privately. "And do you?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, I want it on record." I nodded. "Then you already know what to do." When the settlement was finalized, Claire lost more than money. She lost credibility. She lost the carefully curated image she'd relied on for so long. There was no public spectacle, just quiet accountability. She sent me a letter once, 3 pages, apologies tangled with excuses. I read it once, then folded it and placed it in a drawer. I didn't write back. The children adjusted slowly. They asked questions I answered honestly but gently. Daniel became a different kind of father, more present, more patient. Pain has a way of rearranging priorities. As for me, I learned something unexpected. Grief doesn't only take. Sometimes it gives clarity. I began tending the garden again, pulling weeds my husband used to complain about. I fixed the 3rd step on the porch myself. It still creaked, but less than before. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Daniel sat beside me on the porch. "You're sorry you missed the funeral," he said quietly. I shook my head. I didn't miss saying goodbye. I just did it differently. He reached for my hand, and this time I let him hold it, because in the end, what Claire took from me that day was replaced by something stronger: truth, dignity, and the knowledge that even in grief I had chosen not to look away.
There are days when I still wake up and reach for my husband before I remember. The habit is older than grief. It lives in my bones. My hand moves on its own, searching for warmth that isn't there anymore. When reality settles back in, it doesn't crash, it sighs. And I lie there for a moment, breathing through it, reminding myself that memory and pain can exist without destroying what's left of me. That's something no one tells you. They tell you grief will break you. They tell you betrayal will harden you. But they don't tell you that if you're careful, both can shape you into someone quieter, stronger, more awake. I think back to that morning often, the babysitting request, the softness in Claire's voice, the way I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, believing I was doing the right thing by saying yes. And I don't blame that woman. She loved her family. She trusted the people closest to her. She believed grief would be treated with respect. That woman wasn't foolish. She was human. If anything, I feel tenderness toward her now, because the real lesson didn't come from discovering the betrayal. It came from what followed, from the long, silent moments where I had to decide who I wanted to be after everything familiar had been shaken. It would have been easy to confront Claire the moment I saw that photo, easy to call her names, easy to demand explanations while my voice shook and my heart splintered, easy to let anger take the wheel because anger gives you the illusion of control. But anger doesn't last. Truth does. I wanted my son to see clearly, not through my fury, but through his own understanding. I wanted the story to reveal itself without me twisting it, exaggerating it, or poisoning it with my pain. That choice wasn't about her. It was about me. It was about honoring the kind of marriage I had lived in, one built on steadiness, not spectacle. My husband never raised his voice to make a point. He waited, he observed, and when he spoke, people listened because his words carried weight. I wanted to carry myself the same way. And here's something else I learned, something that surprised even me. Waiting is not weakness. Waiting is restraint. Waiting is confidence. Waiting is knowing that you don't need to force the truth because lies eventually collapse under their own weight. When everything came into the open, when my son saw the full picture and the consequences followed naturally, I didn't feel victorious. I felt lighter, not because someone else had fallen, but because I was no longer carrying what didn't belong to me. Grief already asks so much of you. It takes your future plans, your routines, your sense of safety. It rearranges your days without permission. The last thing it should take is your dignity. And yet, so often people expect grieving women to be silent, to be agreeable, to absorb discomfort so others don't have to feel it. I decided I wouldn't do that. I would be calm, I would be honest, and I would not protect lies in the name of peace. Because peace built on silence is fragile. It cracks the moment you lean on it. Real peace, the kind that lasts, is built on truth, even when that truth costs you relationships, illusions, or the version of the future you thought you were heading toward. I lost a daughter-in-law, but I didn't lose my son, and I didn't lose myself. In fact, I found parts of me I didn't know were still there. I found my voice, not loud, not sharp, but steady. I found my boundaries, not cruel, not rigid, but clear. I found my worth, not in being needed by others, but in respecting myself. If you're listening to this and you're standing at a crossroads between exposing a truth and keeping the peace, I want you to know something. You don't have to rush. You don't have to explode. And you don't have to convince anyone of what you know in your heart. Pay attention. Document what matters. Protect your dignity. Let people show you who they are. And when the moment comes, because it always does, you'll be able to stand in it without shaking, without shouting, without regret. I still miss my husband every single day. That ache hasn't gone away, and I don't expect it ever will. Love doesn't disappear just because someone does. But when I think of him now, I don't think of the betrayal that tried to intrude on his goodbye. I think of the life we built, the values we lived by, the quiet strength he modeled without ever calling it that. And I think he would be proud, not because I fought, but because I didn't lose myself while everything else was falling apart. So I'll leave you with this question, and I ask it gently. If you were in my place, would you have confronted her right away? Or would you have waited, protected your peace, and let the truth rise on its own? I'd really like to know. And if stories like this, stories about family, betrayal, grief, and the quiet strength it takes to move forward, resonate with you, then stay with me. Subscribe. Share your thoughts. You're not alone in these moments, even when they feel unbearably personal.
Time does something curious after a storm like that. At first, you think it will erase the sharpness, sand it down until everything feels distant and manageable. But what it really does is separate what mattered from what never did. It pulls certain moments into clearer focus, while others fade into something hazy and unimportant. Months passed. The legal matters resolved themselves in orderly, unremarkable ways. Numbers were finalized, accounts were closed, papers were signed. What had once felt heavy and ominous turned into a stack of documents bound with a clip, placed neatly in a drawer. I realized then that closure rarely arrives with a dramatic flourish. It arrives quietly, disguised as paperwork and routine. Daniel found a small place of his own close by. The children adjusted, not without questions, not without tears, but with a resilience that humbled me. Children don't need perfect families. They need honest ones. They need consistency. They need to know the ground beneath their feet is solid, even if the world above them has changed. Claire receded further into the background. We communicated only when necessary, always polite, always brief. There was no reconciliation, but there was no open hostility either. Just distance, space, the natural result of trust broken too thoroughly to be repaired. Once, at a school event, our eyes met across a crowded room. She looked tired, older somehow. Not defeated, just altered. For a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of something like sympathy. Then it passed, because compassion doesn't require proximity, and forgiveness doesn't always mean reopening doors. I began doing things for myself again, small things at first, walking in the mornings, lingering in the bookstore longer than necessary, signing up for a pottery class even though my hands weren't steady anymore. I learned that clay doesn't respond well to force. You have to guide it gently, let it tell you what it wants to become. That felt familiar. At the class, no one knew my story. No one asked about my past. I was just another woman with dirt under her fingernails and a quiet smile. There was freedom in that anonymity. One afternoon, after class, I sat in my car and realized I felt content. Not happy in the loud celebratory sense, not healed in the way people like to imagine healing looks, but settled, and that mattered. I started going through my husband's things more deliberately, not to hold on, but to release. I kept the items that carried warmth, his watch, a handful of handwritten notes, a photo of us laughing over something I couldn't quite remember. The rest I let go. One evening, as I boxed up old files, I came across a letter addressed to me in his handwriting. It wasn't sealed, it wasn't dated, just folded carefully, as if he'd meant to give it to me someday and never quite found the right moment. I sat down before opening it. Inside, he'd written about the business, about his worries, about Mark, about Claire. He didn't accuse, he didn't rage, he simply observed. "I don't want to burden Daniel with this yet," he'd written. "I'm watching, I'm waiting. I trust you'll know what to do if I don't get the chance." My breath caught. Even in his uncertainty, he had trusted me, not to react, but to discern. I folded the letter and held it to my chest, letting the tears come this time. Not the sharp, panicked tears of those early days, but slow, aching ones that carried gratitude as much as sorrow. He had seen me. He had known my strength before I fully did. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in months. The following spring, I hosted a small gathering. Nothing formal, just family, a few friends, laughter spilling out into the backyard. The children chased each other around the garden while Daniel grilled burgers, the smell of smoke and seasoning filling the air. At one point, I stepped back and watched them, and I realized something profound. The story didn't end at betrayal. It didn't end at loss. It didn't even end at justice. It continued, quietly, steadily, shaped by the choices we made afterwards. I thought of all the women who had written to me since I began sharing pieces of my story, women who felt invisible in their grief, women who were asked to stay silent to keep the peace, women who sensed something was wrong but doubted themselves because no one else seemed to see it. If I could sit across from each of them, I would say this: you are not imagining what you feel. Your instincts are not inconveniences. Your dignity does not need permission. You don't owe silence to people who benefit from your quiet, and you don't need to scorch the earth to stand in your truth. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait, not passively, but attentively, with eyes open, with boundaries firm, with self-respect intact. Let life reveal itself, because it always does. And when it does, you'll know you didn't lose yourself trying to protect others from the consequences of their own choices. That, to me, is the real ending. Not revenge, not vindication, but peace that comes from knowing you stood exactly where you were meant to stand, even when the ground felt unsteady beneath your feet.